Hi, welcome to the anatomy video. In this first module of this course, we'll look at the anatomy of speech, how we make language with our bodies. Now, there are many languages around the world where everything you use to make language is visible. These are sign languages, where words are made by combining different hand positions, shapes, and movements, as well as by changing facial expressions. In this course, we focus on spoken languages, and the first difficulty that we encounter there is that not all of the anatomy we use to generate speech is visible. So we're going to start by going over some key bits of speech anatomy and connecting them to the sounds of language. In this video, we'll cover the names for the 10 main parts of the vocal tract. Some of these are already familiar to you, others you may not know yet, or may not yet have a name for. We'll also start to see how each of these parts is involved in producing different speech sounds. Now, I'd love to do this video with just this view, and if we were learning about sign language anatomy, that would be fine, but because we need to learn about parts that you can't see this way, we're going to spend a bit of time with this fine character. Now, this diagram only goes down to the windpipe down here. That's enough for us for now, but you should know that the breathing apparatus, the lungs and the muscles that help us fill them with air, are also part of the speech anatomy. Now, here are the labels for all of the parts we'll be covering. Don't worry about remembering the names just yet. We'll go through them one by one in a moment. For now, let me just point out that some of these parts have very familiar names, and even though we're doing science now, that doesn't mean we have to use weird names. So sure, there are fancy terms for the lips, for the tongue, for the teeth, but in this class, nothing would be gained by trying to use those terms. Lips, tongue, teeth, these words will do just fine. Overall, I'll use regular words wherever they'll work. I'll only insist on weird terms when I think they give us extra power to understand or communicate about phonetics. Sometimes I enjoy the fancy words, and I may share them just in case you're interested, but I'll make it clear when you need to try to learn these terms and when you don't. All right, let's go through them one by one. We'll start our tour of the anatomy with the tongue. That's the technical term for it, tongue. In the diagram, you see it as a big muscle taking up much of the space in the mouth. We move the tongue around to change the sound of a vowel. So we go from E, A, A, A. The tongue is moving to make those changes. We can also move the tongue around to change between different consonant sounds like S, Sh, The tongue is so important for language that the word language is often based on the word for tongue, like in the expression mother tongue. And the words language and linguistics are derived from the Latin word for tongue, lingua. So the tongue is super important, and as we learn about specific sounds in later videos, we'll learn more about how it's involved. The most visible part of the vocal tract is the lips, these guys here, right? You can see them moving, especially for some sounds like in pup, fluff, and mum. Now, I don't suppose there's much to add from the diagram here. The lips are exactly where you'd expect. There's a lot of muscle in there. That's how they move around. Okay, what's next? Next we have the teeth. And you can see these on and off during speech, but we're starting to get back into the internal part of the vocal tract. Now, the teeth are used to make various sounds, like f and v. They're made by putting the lower lip against the upper teeth. And the th sounds, th and th, are made by putting the tongue against or between the teeth, like in thin and this. After the teeth, we're going to look at a place called the alveolar ridge. It's about as far back as I'm comfortable actually touching with my fingers. It's that hard bump just behind the teeth, right in there. Let's look at the diagram. That should make it clearer. It's a small spot. You see that little bump just behind the teeth, but it's very important to language. Across most languages, this is the most popular spot to make consonants. What does that mean? We'll learn a bit more about it later, but for example, in English, this is where we make the t sound in taught, d in did, s, sis, z in zoos, ul in lull, r, n, and lots of sounds in English are made at the alveolar ridge. So I know it's a new term to most people, alveolar. Notice its odd spelling. We don't pronounce that O, but it is there in the spelling. Since we don't have an everyday word for this particular part of the anatomy, I will be using this technical term, alveolar, to refer to these sounds. So you should be able to recognize it when you see it. The next bit we're interested in is the hard palate. It's the area behind the alveolar ridge. And it's hard because there's bone in there, and it makes up the front part of the roof of the mouth. Here, let's look at the diagram to make it a bit clearer. Now, it's not the whole roof of the mouth. The back portion isn't hard. The hard palate is really just this area at the front of it here. In English, we don't have any sounds where the tongue actually touches the hard palate, but the y sound, the y sound as in yes and yay, brings the tongue kind of close to the hard palate. Next, we jump up to that big space above the roof of the mouth. This is the nasal cavity, the space inside and behind the nose. Now, speech doesn't move anything around in the nasal cavity, but there are some sounds, we call them nasal sounds, where air is allowed to pass through this space. For other sounds, they're called oral sounds, the nasal cavity is blocked off. Nasal sounds in English are like m and mum, the n in noon, and the ing sound like in singing. Other languages like French and Clichon have nasal vowels too. You can make different words by changing, for example, a to a. Behind the hard palate is the soft palate. Here's the diagram for that. Because this area doesn't have any bone, it can move up and down. In fact, we use muscles to move it up and down to open and close off the nasal passage, to make the nasal sounds we were just talking about. Not only that, but there are sounds we make by bringing the back of the tongue up to touch the soft palate. These are sounds like the K in cook and the G sound in gig. All right. Now, the next bit is the uvula. The uvula is that dangly bit at the back of the mouth. I like to think of it as that bit you see in a cartoon character's throat when they do a close-up of a yell or something. So here's the uvula that we see in Thumper from the movie Bambi when they're playing on the ice. And then here's our diagram of it. Not quite as interesting, but maybe a bit clearer in terms of the anatomy. It's that bit that hangs down at the back of the soft palate. Some languages have uvular sounds. English doesn't, but to me they kind of sound like you're trying to swallow a sound made at the soft palate. They sound kind of like aka or aga or anga. Down below the uvula and behind the tongue, we have a space called the pharynx. There aren't a lot of languages that use this space for speech sounds. We're going to skip past this for now, but if you speak a language with pharyngeal sounds like Allah or aha, we can spend a bit more time on this in the class. Now, the next bit is a structure that I work with a whole lot, and I'm used to calling it the larynx. That's the fancy technical term, but most people just call it the voice box or the Adam's apple, right here, right? We're going to stick with the voice box for now because that's a really nice term. It has two parts to it and they're both very descriptive of how it's built and what it does. The box in voice box refers to the hard covering around this structure. This covering is made of cartilage like the stiff parts of the ear. It's often more visible in men than in women because this hard structure is more pointed at the front for men and more rounded at the front for women. Here's where it shows up in our diagram. Outside of speech, the voice box has two crucial jobs. First, it protects the windpipe, keeping it open for air to travel from our mouth and nose down into our lungs and back out again. And second, it's a valve. It closes off when we swallow so that food and drink go down the esophagus, which is that sort of that reddish orangish tube behind it leading down into the stomach. Now in speech, the voice box does several things. The main thing is that it produces the buzzing vibration that we call the voice. That's where the voice part of voice box comes from. One convenient way to demonstrate this is to make the S and Z sounds in sequence and alternate between them, like S, S. And as you do this, pay attention to what's changing. Put your fingers against your voice box and say S, S. One thing you might notice is that nothing's changing in your mouth. The jaw, the lips, the tongue aren't moving around when you go from S to Z. But what is changing is that you can feel vibrations turning on and off under your fingers. And specifically during the zzz portion, the Z sound, you feel vibration under your fingers. Zzz. But with the S sound, you don't feel the vibration there. So that vibration is voicing. It's the vocal folds flapping together, vibrating to make that voice. We call the S sound voiceless and the Z sound voiced, and we're going to learn a bit more about that in upcoming videos. Now there's other functions that the voice box does in speech, but we'll get to those in the next module. So that's actually it. Those are the 10 main parts of the vocal tract. Now let's just review those quickly. We have the tongue, the lips, the teeth, the alveolar ridge, the hard palate, the nasal cavity, the soft palate, the uvula, the pharynx, and the voice box. Now, there's a diagram available on the course website for you to look at and review, print off if you like. And I would like you to practice by thinking about making the sounds in your language and really trying to think about what's happening in your vocal tract and see if you can spot where each sound is made, particularly the consonants. Vowels are a bit trickier, and we'll get to them in upcoming videos. But for the consonants, can you feel where you're constricting the vocal tract? Consonants all involve some kind of constriction. Where are you narrowing the vocal tract or even touching, like with the lips in P, for different sounds in your language? We'll get into this in more detail in upcoming videos, but that'd be a good way to start out. In the next part of the course, we're going to be looking at the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is a way to represent these sounds and connect the anatomy we've just covered to the sounds that you're familiar with. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.